human beings get to feel helpless. And that's the fundamental problem that human beings have. You know, we are born very helpless. And when life gets overwhelming, we fall back into the helplessness. Key to helping people, the most fundamental thing, is to help them get over feeling helpless. To help them understand they can actually figure things out and make decisions, make choices. And you can't do that if you're giving medication, because you're saying to them, you can't do it. You need a drug.
All right, let's go to the broken brain theory, okay? Because this is important, because this is sort of the crux of the fraud that has been told. You go to Washington Square Park and ask people, what is schizophrenia?
A chemical imbalance, I guess.
I'm pretty sure it's a neurological disorder.
Overload of brain activity.
They have broken brains. The drugs help fix it.
People with schizophrenia symptoms are often helped by medications that act on the brain, so that makes me think that it's a brain disorder.
When I was a newspaper reporter, I used to write that stuff.
Alterations in the chemicals of the brain.
Biological factor, chemical imbalance.
Because that's what people told me.
It's an imbalance.
DNA.
Neurologically diseased.
But it is intellectual fraud.
Chemical imbalance?
I'm sure the condition has always been there. It's part of the human genome and memnome.
It's easy to prove that it's fraud. I mean, a guy named Kenneth Kindler, who's editor of one of the magazine journals, I think it's Physiologic, I forget exactly which one. In 2005, he says, we have looked for these chemical imbalances and we have not found them.
Most likely chemical imbalances in the brain.
A guy by the name of Arvid Carlson was one of the initial promoters of this hypothesis. 1992 says it didn't pan out.
It's just a brain disorder that develops.
Hormonal, mental imbalance.
Chemical imbalance.
John Kane said in 1993 or 94, big psychiatric researchers, the dopaminergic hypothesis is no longer credible.
I have a neuro degree, so I know it's an imbalance of dopamine receptors.
Didn't pan out.
Something that is just not firing right in your brain.
Didn't happen.
Could be an organic thing in the brain.
Oh, in fact, if you want, I'll get you a book by Steve Hyman, okay, who was the former director of NIMH, and he said there's no evidence, this is in 2002, of a lesion in the dopaminergic system in schizophrenia.
Some sort of chemical imbalance.
So why does the public believe something differently?
I would assume a chemical imbalance.
Because they lie to us.
Chemical imbalance in the brain?
It's sort of a combination of drug companies.
Chemical imbalances.
Groups that they fund, they provide money to.
Some sort of chemical imbalance?
Like the National Alliance for Mentally Ill.
Chemical imbalance in the brain.
The psychiatric researchers, when they're talking to reporters, they'll say, I remember when I was first reporting on this, they would say, these drugs are like insulin for diabetes.
Maybe it needs to be drugs in the same way that a diabetic.
And I'd say, well, how so? And they'd say, oh, it's correcting this chemical problem.
Chemical imbalance in the brain.
Okay, I'd write that.
Physiological or chemical.
Then later, once I did my own research, I'd come back and say, and they'd say, oh, it's like insulin for diabetes. And I said, well, no, it's not. It's not what you found. And they'd say, oh, you're right. Every time, oh, you're right. And I said, well, why do you tell people that then?
Chemical imbalance in the brain.
And they'd say, oh, because it gets people to take their drugs.
I don't know too much about it, but I know that you need medication.
It's a convenient slogan.
Chemical imbalance. Chemical imbalance. Chemical imbalance.
I said, but you're lying. They'd say, oh, but we know the drugs are good for them, blah, blah, blah.
You have to take your pills?
Well, why don't you just tell them that we think your drugs are good for you, but we don't know what's wrong with your brain?
Probably a chemical imbalance.
Isn't it wrong to tell somebody that they have something wrong with their brain when you don't know that?
Much easier to give somebody a pill and get rid of them. You know, when I worked in a hospital that gave shock, if the psychiatric resident was angry at a patient and had no insight into it, within 2 weeks the patient was being given electroshock treatment.
If there's one fact that you can glean from the history of psychiatry, it's the power of psychiatrists to be deluded about the merits of their therapies. There's various reasons for that. But history tells us that really clear. Because the way it tells us that is we see so many discarded therapies that when they first came up, they were seen as miracle therapies. They were seen as cures.
For schizophrenia?
For insanity or schizophrenia. I mean, you know, if you go back far enough, bleeding people was a cure. Spinning people around was a cure. You know, electroshock was a cure. Metrazole convulsive therapy was a cure. you know, scrambling the frontal lobes was a cure.
Through lobotomy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so lobotomy, the frontal lobes are the frontal part of our brain, right? When that was introduced in the 40s, really, it was seen as a miracle therapy. And when psychiatrists initially did research and evaluated the patients who had had their frontal lobes scrambled or cut off, they basically concluded it couldn't make people with schizophrenia worse, it could only help them.
These are things that, when you look back on, you go, oh my God, how barbaric could we be? My sense is somewhere down the road, we're going to look at the current medications that we use now and go, how barbaric.
In the era of neuroleptics, we've had 2 good long-term outcome studies. The first was done by Courtney Harding, who's now at Boston University.
Not without medication. I don't believe it's possible.
She followed the long-term outcomes of people who, in the 1950s, diagnosed with schizophrenia on the back wards of a Vermont State Hospital and given up for lost.
I don't know if they could recover, but somehow adapt and be able to cope with it.
Now, it so happened that in the 60s, Vermont had sort of a very sort of socially progressive model for rehabbing these people. So she followed them up in the 1980s.
It's maybe slightly possible, but probably not.
And here's what she found.
I don't think so. They could recover, but not fully.
She found that 1/3 were completely recovered. Asymptomatic, out there, you didn't ever know they were schizophrenic.
Don't recall that I've seen those cases.
Another 34% were doing pretty well, some pretty good social functioning.
I don't think so.
32% were pretty chronically ill.
I don't think that they can recover fully because that's something, I believe, something so strong would be embedded in your brain.
There's something real key here. Of those who had recovered completely, they all shared one trait. And that trait was everyone had quit taking his or her medication.
No, not without medication.
No recoveries in those who followed the paradigm of care where you stayed on drugs for life.
I don't really think so. No, I think you need to take your medication, yes.
The second, when it was just released,
I think you could live without medication. I don't know if you'd recover.
Following people diagnosed with schizophrenia in Chicago for 15 years. And they found, and this was just reported in 2007, May 2007, that 40% of all people diagnosed with schizophrenia who got off their medications eventually recovered. Asymptomatic, doing well.
Not fully, but I think they could live a pretty normal life.
Now, only 5% of those who stayed on their medications recovered.
I don't think so.
So that's the best long-term study we have in modern times, and it tells you quite clearly that if you want people to recover from schizophrenia, if you want to give them their best chance possible, you get them off the drugs.
Fully, no.
So that study's done. It's funded by you and me, the taxpayers. Now you go and find one newspaper that reported on that story.
I wouldn't think so. I don't know why I wouldn't think so.
Why not? Because the NIMH didn't promote it, psychiatry didn't promote it, and they didn't promote it because it didn't tell the story they wanted to.
From what I've heard, no.
If the reverse were true, 40% of those on drugs recovered versus 5% of those off drugs, that story would have been plastered all over the news.
From what I have heard, I think it's fairly permanent unless there's medication involved.
That's dishonest science. That's of a discipline that's dishonest because when they get results they don't want, they don't broadcast them to the public.
I don't know. Doctors don't know. I don't know either.
Is Harding's story well known? Do you think young psychiatrists are being told, you know, we followed schizophrenia patients up for 30 years, and we found that, believe it or not, we don't have to be so despairing. 1/3 completely recover. Now they all happen to be off their drugs, so what we should do is help them get off their drugs.
Right. I know the data from cross-cultural studies that in countries where they can't afford to medicate, the long-term recovery rate is twice as good as it is in countries where nearly everybody's medicated.
My instinct is probably no.
And the chronic disability rate is twice as high in the United States and other countries where almost everybody's medicated as it is in countries where they can't medicate. These are the World Health Organization studies.
I think it'd be really difficult.
So it was US and 6 other sort of European countries, rich countries, and then the poor countries were initially India, Colombia, and Nigeria.
I don't know. I don't know. I really,
You know where the best outcomes were? In rural India. And there, only 2% of patients, or 4% of patients were kept on antipsychotic medications.
If there was an absolute recovery, that'd be great, but it might also just be sort of learning to live with it.
Now, if I'm a doctor, and I look at those outcomes, and I hypothesize that medication use is a variable that changes long-term outcomes, and I find that outcomes are better in countries where they don't maintain patients on the drugs like long-term, what am I going to decide?
As I understand it, most psychological disorders are lifelong diseases. And I think you can recover in the sense that you can have a happy, balanced life if you're on your medication. I don't know that it can be cured at the moment. I mean, if there is a psychological imbalance and there were some way that they could go in your brain and change your brain chemistry permanently, then sure, but I don't think that's available at the moment.
I'm going to go, oh, Christ, we should be doing something different. We should not be keeping people on their meds all their lives. We should be trying to minimize use.
Without medicine, I think that it's impossible.
Well, was there any discussion of that? No.
The way things work now, no, I don't think that it's possible.
Was there any acknowledgement of that by Western doctors? No.
I sincerely doubt it. They seem to get worse.
Most mental health professionals never even heard of those studies, even though they're done by one of the most reputable research groups in the world.
I think that you cannot recover from schizophrenia, but you can keep it under control.
Reputable and non-radical, too.
That's right. They're not the least bit radical. In fact, they did the studies to show how good the new medications were.
No, probably not.
But they were honest. When they found the opposite, they didn't believe it at first, thought it must be that in countries where they don't medicate, they're using different diagnostic criteria. But they published their findings saying, we don't believe it.
No, I don't think so.
Then, because they're good researchers, they repeated it very carefully using the same diagnostic criteria in all 6 countries and found exactly the same thing.
Probably not.
You see, if they worked for a drug company, they'd have said, this explains it, but they would do no research to show it. The important thing was to make sure that drugs kept selling.
No, I would say that you would need medication.
And in fact, they concluded, the World Health Organization investigators concluded, that living in a developed country is, quote, a strong predictor that you'll never fully recover.
You sit and you point out what a safe room they're in. You remind them that you're not going to give them drugs no matter what they say or do, and you're not going to lock them up no matter what they say or do, that you're just here to be there and talk with them about who they are and what's going on. And you just see people begin to regain their trust in another human being. To have somebody come to you and be more open with you than your best friend is ever going to be. And to talk to you about their lives and what they're going through and their hopes and desires and fears is such a privilege to be allowed to get to know people like that. I mean, there's no other way to do it other than being a therapist.
You keep learning how to do therapy as long as you're alive and doing therapy. That's what makes it absolutely fascinating to be a therapist.
Possibly. Possibly.
I would hope so. I would hope so.
Definitely, definitely.
Every day I wake up and I go to work and I don't know what that day is going to be like, and I love that. Some people would hate that because it would make them anxious. I love that. I love that I can't predict, that I'm going to be surprised, and I always retain, this sense of wonder and surprise at what a person will bring to me.
I do believe there's a possibility for that. I think that could.
Yeah, why not? I mean, anything's possible, right?
Telling that story was the best thing I ever did, the most rewarding thing I ever did. And the reason it was the most rewarding thing was because I had so many patients, so many people who had been there, including many recovered patients who had experienced neuroleptics, found them horrible, who said, thank you for telling our story.
I believe they could.
Yes, I do.
I think anything's possible.
It comes back to what Harry Stack Sullivan said, and that was based on the teachings of his teachers, that we're all more simply human than otherwise. That we all, every one of us has that potential for breakdown, and everyone that's had a breakdown has the potential for recovery.
Yeah, I believe in everybody's possibility for change at any given moment.
Absolutely. I think people can recover from anything.